Back in the late 1980s, I was spending time at my family's home in northwestern Connecticut. Our house sat snugly against a vast forest, which was home to all sorts of animals like deer and bears. The forest was filled with different kinds of trees like oak, maple, and birch. Along the edges of our property stood tall pine trees that were planted years ago, providing us with some privacy. Our backyard was huge, spanning about an acre. We had a vegetable garden, a lawn, and even apple and peach trees growing there. Despite the cleared-out areas, most of our land was left wild, with wild blueberry bushes scattered all around. On our family's land, we had two separate fenced-off areas. One was around the garden, meant to keep pesky rabbits away. Their hutches stood on stilts along the edge of this area. The second fenced-off space was bigger, about half an acre in size. It was nestled behind the woods and was where we kept our chickens. This area sat right behind the grand grape arbor. Our entire property was bordered by ancient stone walls. These weren't your ordinary walls made by people. No, these were made centuries ago, stacked with huge granite boulders. What made them even cooler were the little caves that formed underneath them. It was like having secret hideouts right on our own land. One summer day, I found myself alone at home while my parents were at work. It was up to me to take care of everything around the house. The day started off like any other. I fed the rabbits, checked on the chickens, and watered the plants. After finishing my chores, I decided to relax for a bit. I found a shady spot near the garden and settled down, sipping on some refreshing iced tea. Rudy, my loyal German shepherd, was off exploring on his own. He'd wander off, but always returned to check on me from time to time. However, as I sat there, I noticed something strange happening. Suddenly, everything went silent. The cheerful chirping of birds ceased, and even the distant barking of dogs faded away. The sudden quietness made me feel uneasy. Suddenly, Rudy returned, but he seemed different. His tail was tucked between his legs, his ears drooped low, and his expression was filled with fear. Something had clearly spooked him. Then out of nowhere there was a tremendous thud followed by a crashing sound, as if something enormous had plummeted from the trees. The events unfolded so quickly that it's hard to remember every detail. One moment I was leisurely enjoying my iced tea, and the next there was a loud crash coming from the garden. Rudy and I sprang to attention, our senses on high alert. We turned around to investigate the source of the noise, and that's when we spotted it. There it stood, right in the middle of the garden, not even 20 feet away from where I sat. This creature was enormous, easily 7 feet tall. Its entire body was covered in dark, shaggy hair, but what struck me the most was its face. It had very little hair on its face, just a thin layer of skin, giving it a bare appearance. But what really caught my attention were its eyes. They were an unusual yellowish color, almost like they were glowing. Even though it was somewhat dark under the canopy of trees, those eyes seemed to shine with their own light. The rest of the creature's features were difficult to discern, partly due to the shadows and leaves obscuring my view. I found myself frozen in place, unable to move as I stared into those glowing yellow eyes. Poor Rudy cowered behind me, whimpering in fear. It felt like an eternity passed as we stood there, until the creature finally broke eye contact and charged towards us, emitting a growl straight out of a scary story. That's when I snapped out of my trance-like state. Without thinking, I reached for the closest thing within my grasp, a sturdy stick, and swung it over my head. I backed away, shouting as loudly as I could, but the creature showed no signs of backing down. It continued to advance towards us, unaffected by my attempts to scare it off. As I kept retreating, I stumbled and fell against the sturdy stone wall. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I blacked out for a moment. When I regained consciousness, I found the creature looming just inches away from me. It continued to growl menacingly, baring its teeth as if it was preparing to pounce. Suddenly, everything seemed to move in slow motion, as if I were in a strange movie. I could hear every tiny sound, the buzz of insects, the rustle of leaves. Even my own breath sounded distant and peculiar. It was as if time had frozen, yet was still moving forward. With a thunderous thud, the creature leaped onto me, its weight pressing down like a massive boulder. I feared it was all over for me. I struggled to push it off, but it felt as if I were trying to move a mountain. I gazed up into its eyes once more, bracing for the worst. Then suddenly, everything returned to normal speed. In that moment, I found a surge of strength within me, perhaps fueled by adrenaline, or maybe the creature eased its grip. Regardless, I seized the opportunity to escape. Instead of lunging back at me, it sprinted towards the nearest tree and vanished into the forest. Rudy, brave and impulsive as ever, wasted no time. He leaped over the fence and dashed after the creature, disappearing into the woods in hot pursuit. I dashed after them, my heart thudding in my chest, my feet struggling to keep pace with the rush of fear and excitement coursing through me. Reaching the edge of the woods, I scanned the thick underbrush, searching desperately for any sign of movement, any trace of Rudy or the mysterious creature. But the forest remained silent, except for the rustling of leaves and the chirping of birds, which now seemed distant amidst my growing panic. They had vanished into the depths of the trees, swallowed by the darkness of the forest. I stood there, calling out for Rudy until my voice grew hoarse. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly as I waited, the sun sinking lower in the sky. Then, just when despair threatened to overwhelm me, I heard it, the familiar jingle of Rudy's collar. I spun around, and there he was, emerging from the trees. He looked a little worse for wear, but thankfully he was safe and sound. A wave of relief flooded through me as I saw Rudy emerge from the trees. I didn't care about the strange creature anymore. All I cared about was having my faithful dog back by my side. We walked back to the house together, Rudy sticking close to me, both of us still feeling uneasy and staying vigilant. Once we reached the safety of our home, I made sure all the fences were secure and the gates were tightly shut before we went inside. That night, sleep eluded me as I couldn't stop replaying the day's events in my mind. What was that creature? Why did it flee? And what had Rudy encountered out there on his own? These questions swirled in my head, but I had no answers. Despite the uncertainty, I felt grateful that things hadn't turned out worse. Even now, after more than 25 years have passed since Rudy's disappearance, the memory of that day lingers in my mind. It's a mystery from the Connecticut woods that I'll carry with me forever. On a typical evening, much like any other, I found myself driving home from my job as a park ranger in Elk County, Pennsylvania. My home was just outside the small town of Benezet, where everyone seemed to know each other. The route I took was one I knew by heart, a winding road bordered by thick trees. Despite its familiarity, I never dared to drive it with my eyes shut. That would be reckless, but you catch my drift. It's a peaceful drive, especially at night when the world around me is hushed. So there I was, probably around midnight, cruising along. I had just passed the local cemetery, a place that always makes me feel a bit uneasy, even though I don't really believe in spooky stuff. The moon was at its fullest, casting an ethereal glow over everything. It's strange how a full moon can transform familiar sights into something mysterious and different. As I curved around a bend in the road, my attention was snagged by something unusual. Initially, I thought it might be a deer or an elk. They're quite common in these parts. However, as this creature stepped into the path illuminated by my headlights, I realized it was no ordinary animal. It's challenging to put into words what I saw. Imagine trying to describe a color you've never seen before. The best I can do is liken it to some sort of skinless dog or coyote, but with a peculiar twist. It had features that seemed almost human. Its fur was long and black, yet its face, strangely, resembled that of a person more than an animal. At first it darted on all fours, but as it reached the road, it abruptly stood up straight and began sprinting. This creature was truly strange. Its arms stretched out really long, and its hands were a strange mix between paws and human hands. With wide hips and short legs, it moved in a hopping sprint rather than a regular run. I couldn't even begin to guess how fast it was going, but in the blink of an eye, it darted across the road and vanished into the trees. As I processed what I had just witnessed, my thoughts were racing a mile a minute as I continued driving past the spot where the creature disappeared. All I could think about was reaching the safety of my home as quickly as possible. I didn't break the speed limit, but I definitely pressed down on the gas pedal harder than usual. After arriving home, I made sure everything was securely locked, windows, doors, you name it. Sleep was the last thing on my mind that night. I was too on edge, too unsettled to even consider closing my eyes. The following day, still feeling shaken, I reached out to my brother. He lives about 10 miles away, so I asked him to come over so we could return to the spot where the strange encounter occurred and see if we could uncover any clues. So there we were, the day after the sighting, my brother and I standing together at the exact location where everything unfolded. We combed through the area, searching diligently for anything unusual, but besides the lingering odd smell, there was nothing. It was as if whatever I had glimpsed had simply vanished into thin air, leaving no trace behind. My brother has always been more open to mysterious things than I am. As I told him about what I saw, he listened carefully, not even surprised by my account. It turns out, he's had his own share of strange encounters in our area. He started sharing stories about the odd noises he's heard at night and the shadows he's spotted moving in the woods. He never mentioned these before because he thought I wouldn't believe him. We spent a good part of the day wandering around, discussing what this creature could possibly be. My brother's idea about a portal or gateway wasn't just a random thought. He had been piecing together stories from around our town, ancient legends, recent sightings, and odd happenings. According to him, there's a long history of unexplained events in these woods. Disappearances, strange lights, eerie sounds, you name it. Now, I'm not saying I suddenly believed everything my brother said, but I couldn't ignore the pile of questions stacking up in my mind. This strange encounter wasn't just a one-time thing. There seemed to be a pattern emerging, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss it as mere coincidence. As we continued our discussions, my curiosity grew stronger. I decided to do some digging of my own. I headed to the local library, searched through the internet, and even talked to some of the older folks in our town. The stories I uncovered were quite diverse. Some seemed too far-fetched to take seriously, but others, well, they had a certain authenticity to them that made me pause and think. One term that kept popping up in my research was skinwalker. It's a legend deeply rooted in Native American cultures, describing a being with the ability to transform into, possess, or disguise itself as an animal. The description somewhat aligned with what I had witnessed, but I wasn't ready to jump to conclusions just yet. After that encounter, I found it hard to sleep peacefully at night, and every little noise outside my window made me jump. I made sure to keep my curtains tightly shut and my doors securely locked. I even started taking a different route home from my job as a forest ranger, steering clear of the stretch of road where I had that unsettling encounter with whatever it was. During the day, my mind was consumed with trying to unravel the mystery. I began taking walks in the woods, always during daylight hours, of course. I searched for any signs of the strange creature I had seen. Most days my efforts turned up nothing unusual, but there were moments when I caught fleeting glimpses of something strange in the distance or heard peculiar noises that I couldn't quite explain. These moments only fueled my determination to uncover the truth. The whole ordeal started to dominate my thoughts, causing me to become distant and preoccupied. I tried to explain what had happened to a few of my friends, but I could tell they didn't really believe me. I couldn't blame them. If I hadn't experienced it myself, I might not have believed it either. It's been quite some time since that night, and I still haven't found any definitive answers. However, I've come to accept that there are mysteries in this world that defy explanation. I'm not sure if I'll ever encounter that creature again, and part of me isn't sure I want to. Nevertheless, the experience has opened my eyes to the possibility that there's more to our world than meets the eye. As for that particular stretch of road, I continue to avoid it. Perhaps someday I'll summon the courage to drive it at night again, but for now I'll stick to the longer route home. It's remarkable how one encounter can completely shift your perspective. I used to scoff at tales like this, but now I find myself sharing my own experiences with others. Jen's evening began calmly enough. With the windows rolled down and the radio playing, she drove through Loveland, Ohio. The air felt thick and damp as a summer storm approached. Despite rumors of strange things by the river, Jen brushed them off as just stories. She looked forward to spending time with her friends over the weekend. However, as Jen drove, a strange sensation crept over her. She turned down the music and slowed her car. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She was near the river, where she planned to meet her friends for drinks and a bonfire. Walking towards the meeting spot, the usual sounds of the forest replaced her music, but Jen tried to convince herself it was just her imagination playing tricks. But then, she saw something in the shadows. A figure stood there, half hidden by trees. Jen froze, unsure of what to do. She strained to see if it was one of her friends. Just as she was about to call out, a strange noise echoed from the woods. It was a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down her spine. Jen hesitated, listening for any movement, then the air felt heavy with an eerie energy. She tried to reassure herself that it was nothing out of the ordinary. As she approached the river, the moonlight danced on the water's surface, casting strange patterns, but there was no sign of her friends or the bonfire. Instead, Jen felt like she was being watched. A rustling in the bushes made her jump, so she spun around, searching for the source. According to local tales, the Loveland Frogman lurked in these woods. Jen didn't really believe in it, but she couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. Suddenly, a splash caught her attention. She turned to see a creature emerging from the river. It was unlike anything she had ever seen before. Its skin was slimy and covered in scales, with huge, blinking eyes. The creature stood upright, its gaze fixed on Jen. Fear gripped Jen as the creature approached her. Its movements were fluid and unnatural. She wanted to run, but her legs felt like jelly. Then the creature's mouth opened wide, revealing toothless jaws. Panic surged through Jen as she turned to flee. The creature followed, its eerie croaks echoing through the night. Jen ran as fast as she could, stumbling over roots and branches. The woods seemed like a labyrinth, trapping her in a nightmare. Finally, she burst into the light of a gas station, her heart pounding. She told the clerk about her encounter, but they didn't believe her. Jen tried to laugh it off, but she couldn't shake the feeling of dread. After that night, Jen avoided the river and the winding road, but she kept her windows up and the music off. The encounter with the creature haunted her, even though she tried to convince herself it wasn't real. Something strange lurked in those woods, something that couldn't be explained away. Once upon a scorching day in the Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona, I had a remarkable adventure. Under the blazing sun, surrounded by towering rocks and endless desert, I was on a special mission to discover dinosaur fossils. Little did I know, I would stumble upon something so astonishing that even a movie about dinosaurs couldn't match its excitement. As I carefully brushed dirt off a fossilized fern, my pickaxe made an unexpected clang against something hard. It wasn't another fossil, it was a metal panel covered in mysterious symbols. These weren't just random drawings, they were messages left by a civilization that lived in this very place long ago. Following these symbols, like following a trail of breadcrumbs, I uncovered more secrets. It seemed like I was piecing together a story that involved visitors from outer space way back in ancient times. Can you believe it? UFOs flying over the desert thousands of years ago. Now, I'm not someone who believes in wild theories, but this discovery made me question everything. Did these ancient people really see aliens cruising over the Petrified Forest? Were they having conversations with creatures from another world? As the sun began to set, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd found a hidden chapter in history that connects our past with mysteries beyond our planet. While I was busy decoding these ancient messages in the hot desert, strange things started happening. I began to hear whispers, not the kind you share with friends, but the kind that makes your heart race. And then, there was a strange vibration, like the desert itself was alive and trying to tell me something. As darkness fell, I saw something odd on the horizon moving slowly. I tried to ignore it, blaming my tiredness for seeing things. But the whispers grew louder, and the feeling of being watched became stronger. I realized I might not be alone out there. With fear gripping me, I left everything behind and ran. The whispers turned into an eerie hum that seemed to shake the ground beneath me. It felt like the desert was angry that I had uncovered its secrets. Shapes danced in the shadows, and I knew I had to get out of there fast. I left the symbols and fossils behind, escaping the mysterious forces lurking in the desert. As I made my way out, the echoes of those strange sounds lingered in the air. It was a reminder that there are mysteries in this world that we may never fully understand. I decided to leave those secrets behind and return home where things felt safe and familiar. So that's the end of my adventure in the Petrified Forest. Maybe one day someone else will continue where I left off, unraveling the mysteries hidden in the rocks. But for now, I'm happy to leave those whispers behind and enjoy the peace of home. No more strange tales for me. At least, not for now. During my teenage years, I worked at a restaurant set in an old farmhouse. People working there, like the person who made drinks, the one who cleaned tables, and even the owners, all talked about how the house might have a ghost. Some customers who had been coming to the restaurant for a long time also had stories about seeing this ghost. But here's the thing, the ghost didn't seem scary. It actually tried to help out. Imagine this, you lose something in the kitchen, like a spoon or a fork. You look everywhere and can't find it. Then suddenly it's just there, sitting on the counter where you've already checked. Or maybe you lose your keys and they end up under your table, even though you swear you didn't put them there. Once, a kid even found a toy they'd never seen before just appear out of nowhere. Lots of stories like that circulated, and everyone thought of the ghost as a sort of friendly mascot for the restaurant. One day I had to go into the basement fridge early in the morning to get some lemons for the kitchen. Now, nobody was around at that time, which wasn't unusual because I often did early cleaning and prep work alone. But here's where I messed up. I went into the fridge without telling anyone. You see, that fridge had a tricky lever inside, and if the door closed on its own, you'd be stuck until someone opened it from the outside. Plus, the basement had terrible cell service. So there I was, all by myself in the chilly fridge. I noticed we were out of lemons, so I went downstairs to get some. I thought, boss doesn't need to know I'm sneaking down here alone. But it was a big mistake. As I went in, I accidentally knocked over the block we used to keep the door open, and it closed behind me with a loud slam. Panic set in. Not only was it freezing, but my boss would also be mad at me. She always said we should go to the fridge with someone else. I checked my phone. No signal. I realized it would be hours before anyone else arrived, and even longer before they noticed I was missing. I was stuck with no way out. I paced around to stay warm, holding my phone up high to catch a signal, but nothing came through. I was getting really cold and my teeth were chattering. I felt hopeless. Suddenly, I heard the door handle move from outside. I spun around, expecting to see someone opening it, but there was nobody there. Yet the door swung open by itself. I dashed out into the hallway, shouting, but there was no one in sight. I ran up the stairs, scanning the kitchen, dining area, and bar, but it was empty. Looking out the window, I saw only my car in the parking lot. And then it hit me. It must have been our friendly ghost. That was the only explanation. The ghost had let me out, saving me from hours in the cold and the embarrassing idea of having to use a corner as a restroom. I didn't tell anyone because I didn't want to get in trouble, but from that day on, I never laughed at ghost stories again. And you know what? I never went into that basement alone again either.